Okay. So what I thought I would do is follow on from what Alon has been talking about and also what I talked about on Friday, and talk about two papers which, for me at least, have been formative in terms of making me question what I thought I understood about mergers and collusion, and have shaped my thinking about the intersection of those two topics considerably in the last year or two. I want to talk in particular about this paper, Understanding the Price Effects of the Millercoors joint venture. This is really just a merger between the number 2 and number 3 beer brewer in the US. This is a paper by Miller and Weinberg that came out last year in Econometrica. And I also want to talk about this paper, Learning to Coordinate, Study in Retail Gasoline, by Byrne and DeRuze, which is forthcoming in the AER. The things that I want you to pay attention to, I think, in the way through is the fact that both of these questions illustrate what I think are substantive open issues in thinking about coordination between firms and how that coordination actually arises. And then just in terms of how the papers are put together, they're very, very different papers in terms of how they're executed, but they share this feature of pretty much all good papers, which is that they're very focused and targeted in terms of how they ask their research question and then execute it. So what I want to do is to begin by talking about broadly speaking, the research question which made me pay attention to these papers, which is sort of the following. You would be familiar from like a Green Porter, Grim Triggery type super game model that what we might think of as collusive equilibria are supportable over some range of discount factor, right? As the number of firms decrease, that range increases, which leads us to form an intuition that as you get fewer firms in the market, collusion becomes in some sense more likely or easier or something like that. So that forms a lot of our understanding of our sense of how a merger, for instance, might increase the propensity of a market to be cartelized. At that level, seems reasonable, it seems theoretically founded, and that's the intuition that you will see underlying the coordinated effects section of the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines, for instance, in the US. In terms of my little grid here, you might think that we're talking about measuring the market power of a shock, and it intersects with theory in terms of how an agreement is actually enforced. When you dig into it a little deeper, or you do the experiment of how would I actually explain this to my mother on the telephone, though, it's a very shallow kind of understanding of what's going on, because we don't really understand where where in the market empirically this coordination is coming from, or how indeed you select to a particular equilibrium between the vast set of equilibria that can be supported by one of these Green Porter APS type strategies. And it's under getting inside those kind of questions that both of these papers are quite interesting. They're interesting for other reasons as well. So let me begin by just showing you Miller-Weinberg in an overview sense. What happens is that in 2008, Miller and Coors enter into a merger. Legally, it's a joint venture in North America, but for all intents and purposes, it's a merger. So, as I said, Miller and Coors were 2 and 3 in this industry. Anheuser-Busch InBev is the biggest brewer in the US. They're the guys that make Budweiser and things like that. So here are the revenue shares. And you can see that AB has about a bit more than a third market share, and then collectively Miller and Coors has a bit less than a third. Then there's Modelo, which makes why am I... Corona, thank you. This is a Mexican brewery that AB has a 51% ownership share of. So there's a question as to whether you really include this in Anheuser-Busch or not. Heineken is an import, and there's a bunch of other regional and lesser breweries in the US. As you can see, the HHIs are high-ish, but not so obviously high, at least at the national level, as to make this an impossible merger to get past a regulator. It's sort of on the cusp of interesting, and it goes to a second request. Now, this merger was approved, and it was approved largely because there was compelling evidence of efficiencies, which is to say, once the brewing capacities of these two firms are combined, you can lower costs by virtue of getting beer to markets cheaper because you have breweries that are closer to the markets. This is captured in this Aschenfelder, Hosken, Weinberg paper that came out in Rand a little before this one. What's striking about this paper is that it looks like other things happened as well. So this is the price of a 12-pack of Millercoors and Budweiser. There's 3 series superimposed on each other here. The vertical line is when the transaction occurs. And what you can see is prices are trending down a little, transaction occurs, and there's a structural break, and they go high, right? As a control, here's Corona and Heineken, the imported brands, and you don't see the same structural break. So here we've got a really cute sort of diff and div that suggests that something happened as between the 3 majors that was triggered by the transaction. So one of the concerns, as I said, in a merger is that a merger makes coordination easier, and this is the kind of thing that you would expect to see if that was actually happening. So, this is, I think, probably the only paper that's well published that raises the serious concern of what we call coordinated effects arising out of a merger. And that's much of its value. Now the question in the rest of the paper is this really coordinated effects going on, which is to say some kind of explicit or tacit coordination? There's a bunch of ways that the paper answers that. There's a very nice and hardcore structural estimation exercise, which I'll get to at the end of my little session here. But one of the things that this paper does do is also just look at the documentary evidence that's in the public sphere about how this industry works. And that's what I want to focus on a little bit now. The first bit of interesting evidence is that Anheuser-Busch and Millercoors have a pricing strategy which is very much geared towards understanding that their competitors are going to be taking into account their price movements and responding to them. So in discussion of an earlier transaction, which is when AB sought to acquire Grupo Modelo, which is the folks that make Corona, they talked about how what's called the conduct plan, in other words, the strategy document that describes pricing by AB, described their pricing strategy as seeking to make things transparent so that competitors can clearly see what the plan is. Simple, so competitors can understand what they're trying to do. Consistent, so competitors can predict what they're trying to do. Targeted, so they consider their competitors' response. Importantly, by pursuing this kind of approach, Anheuser-Busch seeks to dictate consistent and transparent competitive responses, right? There's a notion here that it starts to feel like they're taking into account a continuation value when they're thinking about pricing. This isn't exactly how I would expect to see someone describe a purely static pricing game. Other sort of amusing documents come from the Miller side, which in its 2006 and 2007, in other words, pre-transaction annual reports, describe price competition as intense. immediately after the transaction, pricing became robust. And they refer to reduced promotions and discounts. And by 2010 and 11, they're referencing sustained price increases and disciplined revenue management, right? Again, suggesting a transition in competitive conditions. So the reduced form plus the documents here set up a nice stage to further interrogate the data by putting structure on it so as to see whether the actual path of observed conduct matches what a model might bring out, which incorporates, say, a notion of coordinated pricing, and that's what happens here. Ali?
The second bit, there's nothing coordinated about it. This could just happen prices went up, so we're saying.
Sure. I mean, this is suggestive and nothing more. If it was always intense all the way through, right, we would think that this jump here is a bit more suspect, right?
But there was a merger.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're arguing about how many reasons there are to look carefully at this, for sure. You know.
Did the joint venture stipulate anything about pricing? They have a joint venture agreement, right? Got through the government?
The paper doesn't mention whether the agreement stipulated as, you know, exactly what the prices were doing. It's treated as if it was just a flat-out merger, so you would expect complete internalization of the pricing externalities across the brands within the joint venture.
So the DOJ, when they said they could do a joint venture, they didn't say anything else about what they had to do as a result?
There wasn't a conduct remedy that I'm aware of. Yes?
Is it possible that prices in this industry were becoming like unprofitably low, or?
Nah. People were not suddenly stopping drinking beer or anything like that. There wasn't a...
Yeah, but there are
and
companies competing.
this is why having, you know, the control part of the diff and diff here is quite helpful.
But that's much higher. This is
Yeah, but
2.6, this is 2.2.
Yeah, but you're comparing trends, right? That's all.
No, but I mean in the American.
No.
When the first document introduced as a response to the merger, or?
This is a complaint from an earlier transaction, but it's telling you how these guys are talking about pricing internally. And this is off annual reports. So this would have been looked at in the review for sure. You know, I'm pretty sure Nate, one of the authors here, was on the DOJ team. He was internal to the DOJ when this transaction went through, so I'm sure he saw much more than this. But this is what was public.
Like what's going on is either that Amber, that's the name, right? Was like trying to coordinate as a response to the merger, or is it that Miller was paying more attention to what Amber was doing after the merger?
So this is a great question. It's one of the reasons, this is why I wanted to start with this paper, because while this is tantalizing and suggestive, oh, sorry. The question was, what the hell is going on, basically, right? Yeah. You know, this is tantalizing but ambiguous. This is highly suggestive, but we don't quite understand how you get from this to this, right? And I agree with this. This is why I wanted to start with this paper, because it sets up the question that I want to go to next, which is, you know, if we don't think these guys are meeting in a smoky room to discuss exactly what pricing should be, how do we get from one equilibrium to the next, right? When we think one of those equilibrium, this one, is coordinated. How do those transitions work? Now, I think this is a substantive empirical question. It's also an area where, at least to my understanding of the theory literature, things are a little, we don't have a lot of guidance, right? Yes?
Yeah, but there are two issues here. One, you're interested in the coordination, which is a very interesting issue, but also, you know, even if they're, suppose they were just playing the stationary equilibrium of the one-shot game, then the fact that there are just less players would mean that the prices would go up.
Right, but to which
Even
price?
if there's no coordination. No coordination, they're just...
Oh, just the unilateral effects. Yeah, yeah, sure.
So, yeah, so
Mm.
there's a need to distinguish between those two things.
Yeah. and so that's why they engage in the structural work later on, right? So what they're going to do at the very back end is to have a model of coordinated effects, a model of the unilateral effects, and see which one the raw data is closer to. That's how they do the decomposition that you are pointing at. But what I want to do is to focus on the coordination part of things. So, yes.
Can I ask about the graph? You keep referring to the important years of control. But they should also react to the price as well.
It depends on the cross-price elasticities.
Right, so that's
Okay.
my question. So isn't it time?
It's nowhere
It's
near
like
as
a market of their own.
it's nowhere near as high as these guys. You do a blind tasting test of these guys, and they taste like fizzy water, right? These things are definitely different, and they're marketed differently. The prices are differently. They're considered a different segment. I can't remember what the cross-price elasticities are off the top of my head, but they're definitely a different segment.
So you're making a little bit of it towards, you're taking both sides of the argument. If the price elasticities are zero, why is this actually in control?
Because what you want to make sure is that there's no cost shock, okay? So both of these things have barley as inputs. This is also why you want to go to the structural model, right? You can decompose all of this stuff coherently. Setting up this is, this is really in the paper used to articulate exactly why they're going to go and do a lot of work. I, however, am going to take a different direction. I'm just going to think about the coordination part of things. So even when you look at Green and Porter in '84, there's actually a really interesting footnote in this thing, which is that their conjecture is that it's logically possible for an agreement that's collusive to arise spontaneously, but it's completely unrealistic, right? In their view, the relative complexity of the conduct suggests that basically they're going to have to be agreeing explicitly, right? So this is a conjecture based on what Rob and Ed thought about the model they were writing down. It begs the empirical question as to, how true is this? So this is one of the reasons why I find this recent paper by David Byrne and Nick DeRoos to be quite interesting, because it gets at this question empirically of how cartels are initiated and how they end up on the equilibrium they are. So the paper, the empirical context of this paper, is retail gasoline in Australia. It's going to focus on the market of Perth, right? This is a city with about 1.7 million people. It's a regional services town, serves the mining industry in large part. If there is an arse end of the world, this is where it is, right? Even Australians think this is remote. In this market, there are about 4 major retail players, BP and Caltex, right, global oil majors, and then Coles and Woolworths, which are both large major supermarket chains, right? So these, in the early 2000s, both of these entities introduced gas stations next to their supermarkets. So this is a very typical market for Australia in terms of where people get their gas. About a third of the market are independent gas retailers. So the institutional feature that the authors leverage here is an interesting one. The Australian government, fueled largely by the Competition Commission, ironically, in the early 2000s, required gas stations to disclose their prices to consumers via a website. And so in Perth, this thing is called Fuel Watch. So the way it works is that at 2 p.m, if you're a gas station, you need to have sent your prices for the following day to the government. At 2:30 p.m, the government posts those prices. And then at 6 p.m. the next day, you're committed to the prices that you submitted for the next 24 hours. Okay? So what that means is that prices are very observable to everyone in the market. Now, when this was set up, this was supposed to help consumers find the cheap gasoline. But about less than 1% of households on any given day look at the website. So the transparency is a double-edged sword, right? It reduces search costs for consumers, but it eases monitoring costs for cartels, right? So bear that in mind as we wander through the data. The data that these guys are going to use is pulled from the FuelWatch website from 2001 to 2015. So it's daily gasoline prices over about 14 years. If you look at the data at a relatively high level of aggregation, it looks like any other fuel market in the world, right? So this is for 2011, for the first quarter pretty much. Here's the cents per litre, right? So CPL here is cents per litre. And you see the typical sawtooth pattern that you will see in many gas station price indices around the world. This is really, really common. And you can see that pretty much every station is following it. This is the rack price, in other words, the wholesale price of gasoline, which doesn't have that sawtooth pattern, right? Yeah, there's a bit of a literature on this. I've always thought it was intertemporal price discrimination, right?
I'm going to talk about the theory of this tomorrow.
Yes, I was about to tee that up. Edgeworth cycles is part of this. So in the original Maskin-Terol paper, you have you model this thing out. It's a very common phenomenon to see in this in retail gasoline markets. Yes. Do you see it in other places? Is that the question?
It's looked like me for that, but I was wondering when you showed it, like zigzagging also in the beers market. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't dug into the data on the beer market. This is, I know what this is in this market, right? This is real patterns in the data, and you see the stations jack up their price, and slowly it comes down over a week or two and then up again, right?
Also during the week.
It's very regular. Now, yes?
I don't know if you want to go into it, but when I see this picture, I wasn't aware of it. I'm wondering why the regulator doesn't intervene.
Well,
I mean, these are changes across a very, fluctuations over small periods. They can't be justified by changes in costs. Why doesn't the regulator require them to fix a price for a longer period?
there was an inquiry into this, at least in Australia, and I have a vague recollection in other jurisdictions as well, because this is a pocketbook issue, right? And so part of the reason why the competition regulator in Australia collects a lot of data on this, makes the transparency happen, is because they're concerned that consumers are getting screwed, right? And so the introduction of FuelWatch was something that came out of the investigations that were prompted by these patterns. You know, they couldn't work out whether it was collusion or bad, but they could at least say, well, why don't we just give consumers the best information possible so that they can avoid paying more than they absolutely have to.
Is there alternative explanation than collusion to this pattern?
Yeah, there's, so, if we think about this as this typically in this market happens on Thursday, right? So this is people filling up the car for the weekend. Prices come down and then up again on Thursday. So if you think that people on the weekend are less time constrained than they are on a weekday, right? You would think the demand curve is changing through the week in terms of its price sensitivity. That will generate something like this. There's the Edgeworth cycles stuff, which Eric will talk about. And I'm going to show you something that is sort of...
Consumers learn over time about the cycle, or are they different?
everyone knows that this happens, but you get hit with idiosyncratic shocks in the middle of the week that means you may have to fill up here, right? Your inconsiderate children who drive the car don't fill it up. I mean, we've been there. I want to define what a cycle is a little more precisely, right? So a price jump for a gas station is going to be any change from one day to the next that's bigger than 6 cents per litre. And a cycle will start on a price jump day. A market price jump is just when the median price jump on a given day across cycles is bigger than 6 cents a litre. And we will define a market cycle similarly. Okay. Now here's where, when you open up data and look at it, you start to think there might be an interesting research paper here. I want to focus on this panel. Each of these different coloured and shaped dot things represent a different day of the week when a market price jump happens, right? In other words, when the median change of a station in the market from one day to the next is bigger than 6 cents a litre. So what you can see is prior to the beginning of 2010, on various different days of the week, you can see these market cycles starting, and then suddenly we converge down onto Thursdays. Okay? So something happens. Similarly, on this panel over here, we're plotting the length of the average station level cycle. So prior to 2010, the average station level cycle varies enormously and at times is up to a month, right? And then it collapses to almost bang on a week. Okay? So there's a transition from one equilibrium to the other that happens around 2010. So the point of this paper is to unpack that transition. So what happens is that there's price leadership going on by BP, right? And this paper is really a story of how this price leadership is conducted by BP so as to transition the market. Okay? So the first bit of evidence that sets this up is really in figure 5 of the paper. And what we see here is the number of station level price jumps by retailer from, in this case, January 2011, and over here, January 2013. So what we see here is that in 2011, which is when the transition is occurring, BP appears to be leading on Wednesdays, and then the market follows on Thursdays. Okay? So you can see the BP stations jumping, and then the rest of the market jumping the next day. That happens week after week after week. Okay? Conversely, by the time we get to 2013, you don't see the BP price leadership happening anymore, right? You know, the author's interpretation of this is the market has settled on a stable equilibrium here that doesn't require leadership by BP. And indeed, each of these jumps is happening on a Thursday. And you know, there's a little bit of residual stuff at the end. So let me further unpack what's going on here. And this is really this set of complicated looking graphs here is the story of what's going on. Yes?
How can we distinguish between BP being leader and like others following BP instead of them following calendar that it's Thursday, it's time to...
Well, that's what the rest of the paper is going to be about. Right. So let me unpack what each of these panels is about. So horizontal axis is years from 2008 through to 2015. And on the vertical axis is the share of station level price jumps that are occurring at the this panel is BP, right? And each of the dots with different colors and shapes represent different days on which each of the BP stations are jumping. So let's pick a... so at a point in time, so say here, this will be a week. There's a triangle and a circle. This is telling us that week something like 25% of BP stations jumped on a Wednesday, and a little more than that jumped on a Thursday. Okay. Now you can see prior to 2010 everything's a bit of a mess. And then in 2010 things become a little more organized. So circles are Wednesdays, and you can see that there's BP is starting off doing quite a lot of their stations transitioning on a Wednesday, and that slowly decreases, right? At the same time, proportionally more of their stations are transitioning on Thursdays until almost 100% transition on Thursdays by about end of 2013. Caltex, on the other hand, looks rather different. Things were a little bit of a mess prior to 2010, but in 2010 onwards, most of their stations transition on a Thursday, right? This panel here is suggestive of BP slowly teaching the market to transition on Thursdays, right? And as they're getting more and more confident of the market's formation of beliefs as to that being the equilibrium, proportionally fewer and fewer of their stations are transitioning on Wednesday, and they're joining the rest of the pack as the pack is learning that that's the equilibrium. To further sort of understand how they do this, we unpack the market even more, right? So what this panel is is the number of station level price jumps on Wednesdays by firm and week, okay? So the triangles are BP, and the blue stuff is Caltex, and then to the extent you can see other dots, which you can't here really, they're Woolies and Coles. So through 2009 to 2010, one can see that BP is slowly decreasing in terms of their propensity to have Wednesday level price jumps, and there are particular points, right, particular weeks where they dramatically reduce the number of stations that are engaged in jumps. So in this first gap, right, this week where the path is very, very different, only 2 stations go on a Wednesday. And over here, there's only 1. The interpretation of these gaps is that these are instances where the BP is using prices and transitions to communicate further to the market and also test beliefs. So this first one, gap 1, you can see also over here, this panel here is the number of station price jumps across all carriers, retailers, that are on Thursdays. So this is Wednesdays, this is Thursdays. On this first gap here, you can see the substitution from a large proportion of BP transitioning on a Wednesday to them all going on the Thursday, right? Prior to this jump, you can see that the other retailers were not entirely well coordinated on Thursday, right? The interpretation that the authors make of this particular exercise is that this is a signal to the market by BP that Thursday is where people should be at. And you can see that following this week indicated by gap 1, the market transitions to a much higher proportion of BP's competitors doing jumps on Thursdays. Okay? Let me now turn to gap 2. In gap 2, again, BP moves most of its stores to transitioning on a Thursday. If you look carefully at these data, the absence of a large number of BP stations moving on Wednesday appears to confuse Woolworths and Coles. These red dots up here are Coles retailers, and you can see that following the first gap 1, they're all coordinated on Thursday, except for the week where they don't see BP moving on the Wednesday, right? The similar thing with Woolworths. Caltex seems less bothered by it. This suggests that the market hasn't really understood yet what BP is pushing them towards. So this is informative, and what happens is over the course of the next 2 years, you see a series of these kind of experiments by BP as they try and test the market to see whether they've reached an equilibrium that no longer requires them to give guidance by moving on a Wednesday as opposed to a Thursday. So these are the two we just observed. There's another set that happens about 6 months later, and sort of every 6 months or so, they're testing the waters. Things start to look quite promising by the middle of 2012, and indeed, it's in roughly August 2012, the responses to these experiments are such that BP at this point, which I think is the middle of August, just stops doing the Wednesday transitions. If you recall, they've been slowly decreasing the number of retailers that transition on Wednesdays anyway, and the market moves to this very nicely coordinated equilibrium with everyone jumping on Thursdays. There's another part of the paper which shows they all jump by the same amount as well, right? Which is rather convenient for them. Just to round things out, this is margins, and you can see that margins, which is the difference between retail prices and the rack rate, increase through this period as well, which is consistent with the idea that they're moving to what's a jointly better equilibrium. Ariel?
Did they check for incentive compatibility in this situation? Does anybody have an incentive to deviate here? How are they enforcing? So, without a demand system, that's going to be kind of hard, right? They don't. This is all. There's not a. This is all of the empirical work. Everything is pictures here, right? They're hampered in their ability to do demand systems because the data is exceptionally good on pricing, but they don't see station level quantities, right? So this is all they can do. Yes?
Could you go back to the price margins?
This one?
Yeah. It seems like they're saving field and networks from possible... no, it's the wrong date, sorry.
All right.
In 2005, there was this drop in the margins. Calls were below zero.
Yeah, so I think part of that was this is where Coles enters the market in late 2004, right? So they're all getting freaked out. So, how am I doing for time? So, one of the reasons why I like this paper is that it very clearly puts forward a plausible story of how a market, without meeting in sort of shady rooms and explicitly talking about stuff, transitions from one equilibrium to something that looks a little bit closer to the kind of tacit coordinated equilibrium that we have strong intuitions for from theory. And it suggests how that might actually happen. What's particularly interesting about it
it's by the sort of very targeted use of price movements and the communication between companies using prices that's key to this. You know, there's more stuff that goes on. There's actually a price war that happens immediately prior to this transition, right? And you know, it's reasonable to think that that price war was useful for focusing people's attention on how to get out of particularly bad equilibrium. So there's an analog here to something that looks a little bit Green Porter-ish. In other markets, other researchers have documented something analogous to this, or nowhere clearly is cleanly exposited. There are papers in spectrum auctions about people using bids to signal to each other as to which lots they should stay away from and bid on, and so on, which is a little bit reminiscent of this. One of the things that I find interesting to think about and reflect on is, you know, the nature of this paper. In contrast to much of what we've talked about here, this is at some technical level a very easy paper to write, right? It's just drawing a bunch of pictures with data. At a different level, I think these kind of papers are very, very difficult to write because you have to have some real economics to talk about here, and it's got to be first order and come out very clearly out of the data. Otherwise, this thing just is a morass of curiosity and nothing more. I also like this paper because it equally speaks to empirics and theory, right? There's a substantive theory question under here which, you know, reading this paper, at least to me, makes me helps me think about, which is how you select equilibria within the set of supportable equilibria in a super game structure. I think there's real work to do theoretically there as well as this kind of empirical stuff. So that gets us back to where we began, which is, you know, what do we know now about how you go from one equilibrium to the next? So now we know a little bit, but getting back to Miller-Weinberg, we know less than we hoped. One of the things that's striking about the David Byrne, Nick DeRue's paper about gasoline that we just talked about is how long it takes for that transition to occur. It takes about 3 years. This happens remarkably quickly then, right? So there's still an open question as to the kind of mechanisms that can support these sort of transitions. You know, that question of how the transition occurs is not something that Miller-Weinberg really can get traction on. What they can do, however, is give you further suggestive evidence that this movement here, from this equilibrium to this equilibrium, is caused by something in addition to the unilateral incentives of the merging parties to boost prices, right? The way they do that is, you know, much more in the tradition of the kind of things that you've seen other people talk about in the last week or so. They estimate demand. Again, they're using the IRI data, right? The demand specification is a random coefficient nested logit setup, so it's a fairly general form of implementation in the spirit of BLP. Instruments, whenever you estimate demand, are going to be super important. Here they're going to be using distance to brewery to get a lot of the exogenous variation. The way they pull out the extent of coordination is by estimating a pricing equation that sort of reinvents some stuff from the early 80s in a sense. They have what's called a conduct parameter in there. So a parameter that attaches to how much I take into account my competitors' profitability when I'm setting my prices. You know, interestingly, that conduct parameter suggests that about 25% of Anheuser-Busch's profitability is internalized by cores and vice versa, right? So this isn't a perfect cartel implementation by any stretch of the imagination. But if you believe that conduct parameter type setup, you know, they're getting significantly better than just pure unilateral effects. And then what they're going to do is to compare the actual pricing data to what happens in a merger simulation under different assumptions on conduct. And that's where we get to this picture, which I'd foreshadowed. So this is the price series for Miller Lite, right, which is a fairly popular, terrible beer in America. Here's where the merger happens. And then here's the actual price data. This is what happens when there's coordinated effects but no cost efficiencies. Here's what happens when there's cost efficiencies of a level that they estimate plus coordinated effects. And this is what happens when you only have unilateral stuff or no merger. Okay? Yes?
Blackjack in a casino, if you don't want to be caught counting cards, you have to shoot yourself in the leg, like you said with the previous paper, only 66% efficiency. So there is, and they don't want to be caught. So maybe.
You think they're trying to disguise their nefarious
Yes.
activities somewhat?
It is possible. It was done also with during World War II in the movie with what's his name?
What, The Great Escape or something? Or?
The
Anyway, I think,
computer,
yeah, the Enigma machine or something. I think we take the point, and this is something that comes up in the theoretical literature on cartels. That I think Joe Harrington makes a series of points in various papers that if you're in a cartel and you think you might be caught, you don't want the cartel to look wildly different for various reasons from competition, because that might affect damages and the propensity for you to be discovered in the first place and stuff like that. Here, given that there's no evidence of explicit coordination, right? This is unfortunate, but would be very difficult to prosecute under current pleading standards in the US, right? So ex-ante merger law gives you much more latitude than what's required to prosecute cartels. So in this instance, I'm not super worried about that, but it's always something that bugs me whenever I do empirical work on cartels. But, yeah. Yeah.
So did total welfare go up or down?
I can't remember.
Because there's a cost efficiency, you might want this.
Yep. Yeah. I'm sure it's in the paper. I don't remember it off the top of my head. So, was there a question? Let me finish there. The takeaways, I think, that are a little interesting by sort of looking at these two papers from this particular angle is that what initiates and shapes coordinated prices is, I think, poorly understood in I/O relative to a bunch of other things we do pretty well. Both these papers, I think, push the frontier forward on understanding this stuff. They're both nice papers in terms of how data and theory speak to each other, right? Although that's done in starkly different ways. When I teach these papers, I'm always debating internally to myself as to which one is the harder one to execute successfully. It's certainly easier to generate the pictures in David Byrne and Nick DeRusa's paper. Pulling out the economics, I think, is a different question. So there you have it. This is an area which in cartels, I think, there's lots more room for work, right? Both in terms of policy relevance, predicting where coordinated effects in mergers are going to be a big deal, and more generally understanding those features of a market which materially lead to cartelization, just wide open. Thank you very much.